What is REST API in AWS API Gateway? A REST API in API Gateway is a collection of resources and methods that are integrated with backend HTTP endpoints, Lambda functions, or other AWS services. You can use API Gateway features to help you with all aspects of the life of API lifecycle, from creation through monitoring your production APIs. The API Gateway REST APIs use a request response model where a client sends a request to a service and the service responds back synchronously. This kind of model is suitable for many different kinds of applications that depend on synchronous communication. Hello everyone, myself Arup Maitra. In this video, I will discuss how to create an ASP.NET Core Web API and deploy into the AWS Lambda function as a REST API and integrate that Lambda function from Amazon Web Service API Gateway as a REST API. So there is a confusion when to choose the REST API and when to choose the HTTP API from the API gateway. So click on that link choosing between REST and APIs. So we can see that REST API and HTTP APIs are both RESTful API products. RESTful APIs support more features than HTTP APIs, while HTTP APIs are designed with minimal features so that they can be offered at a lower price. So choosing between REST APIs, if we need features such as API keys, per client throttling, request validation, AWS, web application firewall integration, or private endpoints, then we need to choose the REST API over the HTTP API. And choose HTTP APIs if we don't need these features included with REST APIs. So there are a couple of features which have been mentioned side by side with REST API and HTTP APIs, which you can check later in from this link. So quickly jump into the Visual Studio. So in my previous video, I have already discussed that how to integrate an AWS Lambda function from an Amazon API gateway as an HTTP API. So if you have not seen this, I have put this URL into the description text box and you can check that video in later. So this is a ASP.NET Core Web API and have a default controller, that is weather forecast controller, and it has a program.cs method which is an entry point where we have registered the AWS Lambda and we mention the event source as an HTTP API. We'll modify this API and we made the changes the Lambda event source as an REST API this time. Click on Save. Now we will deploy this function in AWS Lambda as a new function. So click on Publish to AWS Lambda. So the function name I will choose as a API-REST and other options are same. Click on Next. We are using .NET 6.0 and in the role name I will choose AWS Lambda Basic Execution role, which gives us the permission to write into the CloudWatch logs, and finally click Upload. So this will create a new brand function in AWS Lambda which will work as a HTTP REST API. So if we go to the functions, we can see right now there is only one API, which is an HTTP API. But when this function will be deployed, then we'll be able to see a new function, which name is as a API-REST. So it will take around 10 to 15 seconds to publish this API into AWS Lambda. So you can see the publishing is in progress and it started to zip the code into a zip folder. And it's copying all the DLLs into this zip and it has been shipped successfully, and we can see right now the status is successful. So our API as a REST API in AWS Lambda function has been created successfully. So if we come into the console, Amazon Web Console, and if we click on the refresh, then we can see that our new function, that is API-REST, has been created successfully just in 43 seconds before. So now we will integrate this Lambda function from AWS API Gateway as a REST API. So to do so, we will go to the Amazon console, Web Service console, and click on the API Gateway from the recently visited. And we'll see there is an already existing function, a gateway, which is for the HTTP API, that is for the first Lambda function. Now this time we'll create a new API and we will choose the REST API. So click on build. It will open the API gateway as a REST API, and the protocol is REST create new API. Let's put a name. Let's say Lambda REST API gateway. Description is optional. Let's click on create API. The API gateway has been created. Now click on the actions drop down and create a resource. So configure this as a proxy resource, so it will automatically populate the path as a proxy plus, that which is almost similar to the last time we have created for an HTTP API. Now click on the create resource. So it has been created a resource which is any type, so which means that any method as of this proxy integration will be configured from this API gateway. So the integration type we'll choose as the Lambda function proxy, which is the default one, and we know for our Lambda function is hosted in US East 1 region. So if we go to the function and if we can see our region is North Virginia, that is US East 1. And let's type the Lambda function name over here. Let's say Lambda. So we can see already the two functions has been populated. So we will choose the Lambda function demo API-REST. Now click on save. It's asking to give or add the permissions to Lambda function so that the API gateway will be able to integrate with the Lambda function. So click on OK and give the permission. So permission has been granted. Now we can see the method request where the auth is none, and we can see the ARN, and we can see the integration request as a Lambda proxy, and the method response type as well as the API gateway proxy response. Now if we go to the actions and let's say deploy this API, if we click a new stage, let's put the stage name as dev and click on deploy. So our dev stage has been created successfully, and we have also received the invoke URL as well. So we can see the other options, like as we have seen in the earlier, like it has many features available compared to the HTTP API. And we'll go through these options or features in the later video or in the separate video. Now click on the invoke URL /dev, so we can see the missing authentication token which is expected, and if we click on the /API, you can see our API gateway has been properly able to integrate with the AWS Lambda function, and it is working as a REST API. So we can see the proper output. So now we will check that if I'm able to open the Swagger endpoint from this REST API. But before that, we need to check if the environment variable has been properly updated for this Lambda function, that is API-REST. So if we come to the configurations, in the configuration sections, there is a section called environment variables, and we can see the ASP.NET Core underscore environment variables has been already added, which value is development, and it has been added once we deploy this function, because this is an existing function that we have deployed and created in the first Lambda function, and that time we enable the Swagger. So that time onwards, during deployment, this flag has been already added into the environment variables. So this time when we created this function from the solution explorer and click on right click, so if we click on that, automatically, like you can see in the next tab, the environment variable will be auto populated. So you can see this ASP.NET Core development was already there. So that's why this environment variable has been deployed for the REST Lambda function. So now if we go to the endpoint and just change the endpoint as a Swagger and click enter, so we can see the AWS Lambda demo function has been properly loaded via the Swagger endpoint, and we can see the two endpoints. One is API and is weather forecast. Let's try out the weather forecast and see if it is working or not. So click on execute. We can see that we are getting the proper response in the response body, where we can see the city, temperatures. There are 5 different random temperatures along with the summaries, and also we can see the URL has been properly generated, so which is the dev URL, that is staged URL for the API gateway that we have created from the API gateway, from this API gateway as a REST API. That's pretty much as part of this video. Thanks for your watching. If you like my video, please do like, share and subscribe, so that once I will post a new video, that will automatically come into your notification. And we will see you in the next video. Thank you so much.